So it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Keith van Rijsbergen, who I've known for many years. Keith, when and where were you born?
In Holland, near a small place in near Rotterdam, a little place called Vlaardingen, which is about, I suppose, 10 kilometres outside Rotterdam, and it's now really part of Rotterdam. So I was born in 1943.
When about in 1943?
October. Yeah, 17th of October 1943.
Okay.
And my memory kicks in at the end of the war, funnily enough. I remember my family parading in the street, celebrating the end of the war, so that would have been 1945, somewhere, whenever it ended. And that's one of my first memories, in fact. Now, whether that was actually one that was given to me by my mother, or whether I actually remember it, I have no idea. But I do remember this procession down the street with people with lanterns celebrating the end of the war. My father had quite a bad war, actually. He was an engineer, and he was on the run from the Germans during the war. They wanted him to build things to do with the defences of their stuff, and he refused. So then he had to run. And he finally was caught, and then he was sent to a prisoner of war camp on the border between East Germany then and Poland. And in fact, some years ago, when the wall came down, I went to visit the place just to see if there was any remnants of the prisoner of war camp, but it had all gone. So he wasn't particularly happy at the end of the war, but I think he recovered. So our life actually was quite complicated. We travelled a lot. Again, it's because my father was an engineer of a particular kind, and he did engineering jobs all around the world, and he used to take the family with him. So round about 1949, we left Holland for the first time, and he went to Indonesia, and we followed him. Now, in between 1945 and 1949, he'd done some major reconstruction work on the harbours in Rotterdam, and there's still a record of that, and I still have sort of photographs and documents about that. So I have a bit of a sort of a family memory of his work after the war. Anyway, he ended up in Indonesia, and my mother and the children, we were three, it was my brother and my sister and myself, we followed him sort of 3 months after he'd gone there. So 1949, we all ended up in Jakarta, where he was actually doing some work on the harbour of Jakarta, which was a harbour called Tanjung Priok, and he was reconstructing it or something like that. And what are my memories of Jakarta? Well, I remember where we lived, and I remember, so we lived right in the centre of Jakarta, very close to a famous river, which was called the Kali. But probably more importantly is that our neighbour was actually Sukarno. He lived in yes, that's right, he lived in a huge house, and we were in a kind of not exactly a hotel, but it was a bit like a hotel. So I was aware of him very early on. I went to school there, and there's a funny story associated with that. About 10 years ago, I met a fellow computer scientist, a Dutchman, and his name was Kees Costa, and we got talking, and it turns out that he and I, who were the same age, were in the same primary school in Jakarta. And we didn't know each other then, of course, we didn't really remember each other, but in fact, we just met up and discovered that we'd been going to the same primary school. Anyway, my father stayed in Indonesia for about 3-4 years, and we moved around. From Jakarta, I think that's on the island of Java, so my timescales are very vague about this, but we spent some time in Surabaya, which is also on the island of Java. We spent some time in Borneo, in a place called Balikpapan, and then we spent some time in Sumatra on a little island in the river of the Musi, which was called Pulau Kamara. And in all these places I went to school, and in fact I learned to speak Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, and so did my brother and sister, and we conversed in that language. And then when we left, some years after, we completely forgot the language. I have no memory of the language at all, except, you know, one or two words. So it was a 4-year stint. Now, why is that memory still very strong with me? Well, it was like an adventure. I was completely free to roam around, you know, in and out of the jungle, because we often lived on the edge of the jungle. And I mean, I didn't go very deeply into the jungle, but nobody seemed to care about whether I was in the jungle or near the water or on the coast and things like that. So I just have this memory of like being in one big adventure playground. So, you know, it's a very happy memory of 4 years. And then we left. I've never been back. I've kept sort of wanting to go back, but I've never been back to Indonesia. It's very strange, because I have good memories of it, but I haven't gone back at all. So that was sort of the first stage of my childhood that I'm sort of, you know, that I can remember fairly well.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is about your parents as people.
Yes.
You haven't said much about your mother, but...
no, I will in a minute, yeah.
Okay, well that's fine. So I need to know the kind of
Yeah.
psychology of your parents.
Right, so my father was a very quiet sort of type. Occasionally he would lose his temper, and he even would hit us, you know, but not in a very, very severe way, but he just did. He didn't really have much chit-chat. So, if you like, most people would say I was probably not very close to my father, but he looms because it was his activities that sort of determined where we went and what we did and so on. Now my mother was a very nervous person, extremely nervous, and in fact I would say that when my father went to Indonesia in 1949 and asked to follow him in 3 months, she probably almost had a nervous breakdown. And the way that was displayed is that she would have huge arguments with the children. Now remember, I was really quite young. I was born in 43, so I was more of an observer. But certainly, she upset the others. However, the relationship between my mother and myself was actually quite close, because she was always at home. My father worked 12 hours a day, and he wasn't visible that much, you know. So she was quite influential in many ways. And I think the thing that I remember about her as being reasonable is that she always gave us, and particularly she gave me, a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do, providing I told her what I was going to do, and that I would be back home, if you like, at a certain hour. And provided I stuck to sort of those rules, I didn't feel that I was constrained. So now both of them, and all the family actually, so my father, my mother and my brother and my sister didn't finish school. None of them were academically inclined. My mother only went as far as primary school. My father only had 3 years of high school, and subsequently, of course, my brother and my sister also went, I think, 3 years of high school or something like that. I was the only person in the family that was sort of academically inclined and kept going. In fact, my parents never understood what it was that intrigued me about, you know, academic work. And they sort of said, well, you know, why don't you stop doing sums and go and get a job? But and I'd say, well, you know, maybe one day. So,
I mean, at the primary schools you went to in Indonesia, do you remember any teachers or any experience?
No, this is really quite interesting. I mean, I start to remember things more about school when I got to the age of, say, 15, 14. Prior to that, I have virtually no memory of school. certainly not in Indonesia. I just cannot recall, I can recall going to school, I can recall leaving the school and doing things out of school. I have no memory of what I was doing at school, whether I was any good at anything. At that stage, nothing. It's
Mathematics.
just a blank.
There was
No. Mathematics eventually, later on, when I was going to high school, I realised that I was quite good at it. But in the earlier days, there was no sign of being good at it. So after Indonesia, we went back to Holland. This was a recurring pattern. So my father would do these jobs, and he would then return to Holland, and then there would be another contract that he would take on. So the next contract was to go to Australia, Western Australia, and we lived on the outskirts of Perth, in a sort of a normal suburb, and I went to the primary school there. So we're still in the primary school phase, and I have a bit more of memory. So for example, that's where I learned to speak English, and the way I was started on English was that when I arrived at that school, the teacher said to another kid, why don't you take him outside and teach him the alphabet? So I went and sat somewhere with this other kid, and he took me through the alphabet in English, right? And believe it or not, that's the only thing I remember about learning English. The rest was just done by osmosis. It was most extraordinary. Now I think back over it, of course. My parents had this attitude, because they weren't particularly academic, that if we moved from one place to another, that the children at that stage, not just me, would just go to the local school. And whether it was a school with a working language was English or German or whatever, tough, they would just dump me in the school, and I was expected to just get on with it. And well, I did. I mean, in Perth, on the outskirts of Perth, it's closer to Fremantle actually. I don't remember anything traumatic about not being able to speak the language. I just made friends and used sign language, I guess, and gradually learned to speak English. Now that's where, at that school, they discovered that I was quite good at certain things like maths and science. So after about a year and a half, I think, or maybe a little bit more, I don't know, they accelerated my promotion through the system, and I was put into first year high school a year before I should have been. However, it didn't help very much, because we soon after left to go back to Holland. And again, my memories of living in Perth, Western Australia, so there are some minor memories of the school, but the recurring memories are getting on my bike and cycling to the local beach and spending time, diving off the jetty. I don't know, always I used to go to the beach and swim, and during the winter I would spend a lot of my time just walking around with a friend actually, walking around the bush, the local bush. So a lot of my time was spent outside. Now, I did read a lot, but it was always in the evening, or when I don't know, it just didn't seem to interfere very much with my outdoor life. And the outdoor life is the thing that I remember most. And now you asked me about a teacher. There was actually a teacher at that school. So the school was Hilton Park Primary School. There was a teacher, I think his name was Simpson, who I do remember. And in fact, many years later, I have a very good memory for faces. I bumped into him in Fremantle. So, and I sort of, went up to him and said hello and so on. But of course, he didn't remember me.
Was he a good teacher?
Well, it wasn't so much. I think it was because of his kindness, actually, that I remember him. I don't remember him because he was a good teacher. I don't. At that stage, I don't really have much of a memory of teachers being either good or bad. I remember them being more or less violent, because they used to cane people. But he was rather a kind person. I do remember him, and so that's my memory of that. While we were in Western Australia, the Queen paid us a visit, and we were all lined up to wave little flags when the Queen arrived, and it must have been an important occasion. So we're talking about something like 53, 54.
Yes, after the coronation.
Right. So she came to Australia, and she visited. In fact, she visited the school, I think. Yeah. And so that's another thing I remember. It was a big occasion. But the biggest memory I have of this is all very strange, really. The biggest memory I have is of swimming off the coast of Western Australia. I mean, I like swimming, and I've liked it all my life, and I still remember that very well.
You talk about all the walking around. I mean, were you just walking aimlessly, or were you collecting butterflies, or doing anything systematic?
No, nothing systematic. It was purely kind of pretending to be either a cowboy or an Indian, right? And the bush was on the edge of where we lived, so all I had to do was cross the road, and I would be in virgin bush, just about. I mean, it was, but you know, Australian bush is not very, dense. It's just it's quite open, so and it's not dangerous because I mean there are no
snakes.
Snakes. No, I don't know that we particularly worry about snakes. So anyway, and of course in those days you go around barefoot. So I suppose if there had been snakes, we would have been in trouble. But no, it was just ordinary bog standard Australian bush. Nothing special about it. Yeah. But I do remember it. So then we left Australia and again went back to Holland. Now I think this is actually from a school point of view, it's quite a critical moment. So we went back to the usual area. In fact, I think we may have stayed and lived with my grandmother for a while. Yes, in fact, I think we did. But anyway, I was then, because I'd just gone to the high school in Fremantle, a school called Fremantle Boys, I was then put into a high school in Dordrecht, which is a fairly famous Dutch town, and it was a sort of a, how do you put it, it was called the MULO, which is a school that teaches children useful things so that they can go into commerce, right? So bookkeeping and things like that, but also other things like languages and obviously arithmetic and maths and so on. So at that school they discovered that that I was quite bright academically, right? In other words, I should really be in a more academic school. So the teacher, or maybe several teachers, I don't know, they recommended to my parents that I'd be sent to a thing called the RBS, which is a sort of like a gymnasium, right? Which basically streams children for university. And that's where my interest in science and mathematics and so on took off. So I had to get some extra coaching in mathematics to catch up, because I've been in this other school which wasn't really all that great. And I was given some extra mathematics coaching, and then basically caught up. And also I realised myself that I was rather good at things like physics, for example, and certainly I was good at mathematics. Now we went back to live in the place where I was born, and that's where I got to love going to the cinema. I certainly continued to read a lot, although probably mostly novels. I read a lot of books. Famous German authors. He's well known in Germany and in Holland. A chap called Karl May. He wrote books about cowboys and Indians. So I did that. So my reading was pretty extensive still, but mostly sort of light stuff. I continued swimming, and
when did you start wearing glasses?
In Australia, when I was just in this transition period from primary school to
quite young.
to high school. Yes.
So short-sightedness.
Yes.
And Yeah.
So
This has often an effect on, it's supposed to have an effect on personality, and particularly games and things.
I think it probably did on me because I felt, I can still remember feeling quite shy about having to go walk around in glasses, yes. But I don't remember it persisting. But I do remember it, and I mean, I used to go to school, I think, and then I don't know, I felt self-conscious about it, I think.
Did it stop you playing games at all? Were you a keen games player?
I was not a keen games player. I mean, I did games. You know, I played cricket. I played Australian rules football. But you see, in terms of sport, my favourite sport was swimming. So I always tried to get into a situation where I could do less of the other sports and more of swimming. And I continued doing that all my life, almost, I suppose. Yeah. I always resented really to do these other games. I don't know, I just felt that it was a kind of it was constraining in some way, and so I'd rather just go and do something like swimming where I'd be on my own. So I wasn't a great team player in that sense.
So were you at all rebellious? It sounds as if you...
Yes, I was in Holland, for example. I was actually suspended from school for a couple of days because I did something wrong. Now, what was it? What did I do wrong? Oh, I can't remember. Probably swore or something like that. Anyway, in the presence of the headmaster, I tended to be, I often was, and certainly at that stage already, I tended to be slightly resentful probably of authority. People kind of, you know, trying to contain me and not allowing me to do the things that I wanted to do. This led me into trouble. And also I used to do things sort of, you know, just because I wanted to do them. And then of course there would be some rule which said you shouldn't do that. And then I'd get into trouble. Yeah, I was fairly rebellious. The other thing is that I was going back a bit when I lived in Australia. I used to go around pinching fruit. I used to climb into sort of farmers' orchards and walk off with a bag full of fruit. So I'm sure that I don't know whether that's rebellious or just being extremely naughty. But yeah, so yeah, a little bit of and also then from Holland, then having gone back and having gone into what I thought was a reasonable education system and being taught physics and maths and things properly, I was also taught. I was given the beginnings of French, and I was given the beginnings of well, not the beginnings of English because I already had English. I was also given the beginnings of German. The Dutch system in those days was very extensive. I think I had about something like 17 subjects. So you had to do, you know, maths, physics, geography, geology, French, German, English. I mean, history. I mean, you were just expected to do everything, and you did it to quite a reasonable standard, actually, as I discovered. So yes. So that. Oh, and I also one of my memories of that period is, of course, that which is a sort of a landmark, is that I went to the World Exhibition in Brussels. So that must have been around about 57 or thereabouts. At the same time, or just before the exhibition, the Sputnik had been put into space, and the Russians had a display model of the Sputnik at the exhibition in Brussels. So that's another memory. I enjoyed it actually because they displayed a lot of the pavilions displayed quite a lot of what was then, I suppose, modern technology. So, for example, I remember seeing the first colour television set in the American pavilion. See, we had family in Brussels, and we used to visit them quite regularly, so it was quite easy for us to go there and then spend a few days at the exhibition. My father had came from a very large family, so some of his brothers lived in Belgium, and he kept contact with them. So he would drag the family along. My mother had she came from quite a small family, and her father was a market gardener, and she had a brother and a sister. She didn't keep that much contact with her family. It was mostly on my father's side that there was contact, and that persisted over. Yeah, in fact, I still have contact with some of the family, but not in Holland. They've tended to be elsewhere, distributed over the world. So that takes me to the next stage of my father's career. So I'm timing it by his activities. So although, as I said earlier on, I didn't see all that much of him during my childhood, although he obviously had quite an influence. We went to what was then called Southwest Africa, Namibia, and this is the last 3 years of my high school, and we lived in a town called Walvis Bay on the coast of Namibia, and the Skeleton Coast, and the area around was the Namib Desert. The school was actually in Swakopmund, which was just, I don't know, about 40 miles away, I think. So I travelled into Swakopmund every day by bus, go to school and come back. Now, the interesting thing about that is that although the school was what you might call Afrikaans and English, a lot of the kids that I knocked around with were German. And so I learned to speak German simply by osmosis. And I read a lot of stuff actually in German. In Stockholm they had a very good bookshop. So one of the books that influenced me in terms of pushing me in the direction of science is that I read Fred Hoyle's book. I think it's in English. It was called The Frontiers of Astronomy, and I read that in German. And now that I look back on it, I think, how did I do that? I must have been really enthusiastic. Anyway, so that's when I started to look at books which had a lot of serious scientific content. So I read a book by Rutherford on the atom, and in fact at that time I also, and I don't think I could have read it properly, but I read a lot of Eddington's Nature of the Physical World. That I read in English, and so the Rutherford book. So I started, and I was reading literature. In fact, the writers that I remember reading very much, probably like every other teenager, was Dostoyevsky. I worked my way through all the Dostoyevskys at that time, and I mentally decided that I was a member of the beatnik generation. I think all that came to was wearing a floppy sweater and something like that, and talking with my friends about, well, what would I have talked about? I don't know.
Pop culture.
Yeah, something like that. But anyway, so this was a time when I think academic type thinking and academic type reading became more important. However, it's a recurring thing in my life actually. I continue to swim, and the reason that's quite strange is because there is a cold current that comes up from the Antarctic up the west coast of Namibia, and it's very, very cold, the water. Now, I couldn't put a temperature on it, but it's probably something like 16 degrees or even lower. And in the summer, especially, I would go for a swim. There's a pier in Swakopmund that goes out into the sea, and I used to swim around that every day. It was quite rough. In fact, the water used to break, and I used to just swim around it and then back again. And I did that all the time that I was actually in that part of the world. So now, again, the same thing arises. So the issue about that a lot of my memories are to do with the things I did outside school. So, for example, in my holidays, I worked on a fishing boat. So in the summer, the boat would be functioning as a trawler, and I was a deckhand on it, just basically sorting fish and also, cutting them. I think sometimes filleting and so on. So that's a very nice memory. And in the winter, it was converted to catching pilchard and by net, and that was a night activity. They tended to do the fishing at night. So I have memories of going out in the boat because we had friends who had, one of them was a skipper, and he had a boat that did all this. So that's and the other thing I remember very well is going up country and going hunting. I mean, really hunting. So
With a gun.
Yeah, with a gun. And it was a friend of mine whose parents had a farm up country, and he invited me to the farm, and then he said, let's go hunting, and we got the works. So there are these, and I spent quite a lot of time actually walking around the desert. This is sort of real sandy desert, near where we lived. I would just go into the desert and walk around. I used to enjoy that immensely. And further afield, so people would occasionally invite me on a trip down the coast, and we would go into some other part of the desert and so on. So these are all very strong memories. In terms of friends, although I had friends at these various stages, in Namibia at Swakopmund, I made a very good friend, a chap called Leonard Kruger, and I remained in contact with him for quite a number of years after we left, actually. The ones that I made before that, I would sort of briefly stay in contact with, but eventually that would fade. The other thing we did, and this again, my parents, the whole family in fact, we would go on vacation in South Africa. So we had a Land Rover, so we would drive down into South Africa, and so we'd vacation in Cape Town and in Durban. And you can imagine that was quite a spectacular journey through very arid conditions, and when we went to Durban, we crossed the Drakensberg mountain range, and so we saw quite a lot of South Africa. So there was an event which was quite important actually in many ways in my life that took place while I was towards the end while I was living in Namibia, and I was in a major train crash. The train that I was on was a through train. Was going from Windhoek to South Africa, and I was going to go across and visit my brother who was then in Durban, and it had a head-on collision with another train, and I was in the front coach, and the coach that I was in, the engine in front of the train, which had a fuel tank behind it, which is in the shape of a cylinder, just went straight into the coach and smashed its way all the way through until it got to my compartment. And so everybody in front of me, if you like, this was in the morning, everybody was still lying, sleeping, and all the people in the front bit were killed basically. And I just crawled out of the wreckage virtually unharmed. And so, but it was it sort of, I had the presence of mind to take photographs. So I took photographs when I got out, and then just walked off to the nearest road and started hitching, and just got out of there and continued my journey. But it was a major event in that part of my life.
It's a bridge to something which often happens around this time, just between adolescence and growing up, which is religion. Did this have did you thank God for this?
No.
And more broadly, what is your religious background and position?
My religious background. So, my parents basically, I think, inherited the religion from their parents, which was fairly Protestant Calvinist. And there was a moment when I was probably 6, 7 or something like that, that they said to me that, or maybe I asked for it, they said I didn't have to say grace before the meal anymore, I could, if I didn't want to. I think they had lost their religion. I myself, I think, probably decided that I was not religious around about the age of 14 or something like that. In other words, I had no desire to go to church, and I certainly didn't kind of personally think that I believed in God or anything like that, so I was not religious. I mean, I like the phrase that is it Martin Rees said. He was he's a Christian, he said, but it's oh yes, he said, Martin Rees once when asked, said he was a non-believing Christian. And I thought, yeah, that's actually quite close to what I am. In other words, I understand and I accept the culture that we have has come out of Christianity, but just because I accept it and I go along with it and I admire it actually, doesn't mean to say that I have to also believe in God, right? So I kind of thought, when I heard Martin say that, I thought, yes, that's a pretty good description of the way I am actually. So I also, when I was a teenager in Namibia, I read, and I can't remember much of it actually, but I read a lot of Spinoza, and that must have had an impact on me as well. So the other, I think Dostoyevsky perhaps also, I don't know, but there were things I read which I think made me become more skeptical about a religion, and so I guess I just sort of stepped sideways and said, right,
it's never been important since.
No, it's never been important. The funny thing is, of course, that my wife, which is amusing, is she's the daughter of an Anglican vicar, right? And I'll come to that in a minute, because that made me take an intellectual interest in theology, which I kind of pursued later on. So yeah, I don't have any. I'm not like Richard Dawkins, right? I don't antagonistic towards religion. I mean, for me, it's if people want to believe in religion or Christianity or whatever it is, that's fine. I mean, it's not something that I take issue with. I actually enjoy having proper arguments, theological arguments. I quite enjoy that from a philosophical point of view. So yes, so that's sort of what happened. The other thing that happened in South Africa, in Southwest Africa, in Namibia, was that I stayed on there on my own for a year. So I was in the last year of school, and my father wanted to. His job was finished, so he wanted to go on to the next contract, and that required him to return to Holland. So they said, okay, we've got to go back. You haven't finished school yet, so why don't you just stay here and finish school? So they arranged for me to be accommodated. This is quite funny actually. They go in a maternity home. Believe it or not. This maternity home had rooms that they rented out to people, and so they got me a room. So you can imagine it's convenient because breakfast was laid on and meals as well. So I stayed in that maternity home for a year. The thing that I didn't tell you about actually, which was I suppose is one of the traumatic periods of my life. When I first arrived in Namibia, and again my parents did the usual thing, so they sort of inquired what would be an appropriate school for me to go to, and it was the high school that various people went to. The headmaster determined that because I didn't speak Afrikaans, I would have to learn it, because to cope with the school, it was important that one could speak and understand Afrikaans. So they had decided in their wisdom that that I would go into a hostel there. Right? So for 6 months I was in this hostel with boys, yeah, and to learn Afrikaans. And unfortunately, I was not very popular. And the reason was that I had made a lot of friends who were English stroke German, and there was this kind of antagonism between the Afrikaners and the English and the Germans, who were, if you like, in political terms, probably more liberal. So I was seen as one of them, and so every few days I would have a fight on my hands, and I would get involved in rather unpleasant business, having to defend myself. So eventually I just got fed up. This must have been at the 6-month mark. I rang my mother and I said, I'm coming home. I'm not staying in this hostel. And so I just packed my suitcase and I left. And they said, they must have realised that it was serious, because they said, okay, you can stay, right? You've probably learned enough Afrikaans to get by. And in fact, I had, because at the end of my time at that school, you have to take, as well as doing your leaving certificate, as it was called, you were told that it was a good thing to take a taalbond certificate, and that meant that you were tested on English and Afrikaans, and that meant that if you passed it, you were properly bilingual. So that's I don't know. I still occasionally read Afrikaans, actually, because it's so close to Dutch that it's not really difficult for me to retain it. So the other thing I did while I was at school there was, because I decided that the mathematics was poor, and I explained this to my parents, and they said, well, if it's poor, why don't you sign up for one of these correspondence courses in mathematics that they run out of Holland? So I signed up for what you might call additional mathematics, and I did that, and brought my mathematics up to a standard that went beyond what was offered by the school. So that's, but it's interesting. I think from going to school there, I probably I sort of got my love of languages and literature. In other words, the language courses, especially English Lit, was taught to quite a high standard, and we were expected to read quite a lot. So I think that's where it started, actually. I think that actually was the English literature teacher was one of the people that I remember very well, and I liked. He was a rather unusual person. He used to invite me around to his house, and I used to play chess with him, which was interesting. I think he must have realised that I was academic inclined, because he always encouraged me. But he was no scientist, right? He just encouraged me on the language, on the literature side. So we come to an end of another era, right? So that was Namibia, and my parents then wrote me and said, because I'd enrolled to go to university in Namibia, in Natal, to study mathematics, and I got a scholarship to do that. After I'd made all these arrangements, my parents wrote to me and said, we are going back to Australia, and we are coming to collect you on our way. So they came down to Durban. I made my way across Durban, and they arrived in Durban, and then my brother was also already in Durban. My sister had already gone back to Australia, and they collected us, my brother and myself, and we got on a cargo vessel which took a small number of passengers, and made the crossing over to Australia. And they said, well, we know you've enrolled in university in Natal, and I'm sure you'll be able to do the same thing in Western Australia. So there you go. I was again moved to another education system, And of course, it wasn't as straightforward as they said, because as it turned out, University of Western Australia didn't it didn't recognise immediately my qualifications. So they said, we'll let you start, but it's only provisional, and we'll try and get these qualifications of yours accredited. So by the time I was through, about 2/3 of the way through my first year at university, they finally wrote back to me saying, it's all right, you can stay, which was very kind of them.
You did mathematics.
Yes, what I wanted to do, which is I wanted to do physics and philosophy, and of course mathematics. And the university wouldn't allow philosophy, so I started to do physics, chemistry, pure mathematics, and applied mathematics, and which was, in a sense, I felt was a bit of a compromise, because I wanted more than just the sort of pure science. I wanted some other aspect, and we'll come to that later, because I'd actually tried to make up for that later on. Anyway, so I started university, and I had a lot of catching up to do in some aspects actually, but that happened all right. It wasn't too difficult, but no sooner had I started my university course than my parents left, and they went to the east coast of Australia. So once again, I was on my own. Well, it didn't seem so hard at the time actually, but it's rather amusing that they hauled me all the way from Natal to the west coast of Australia, and then promptly deserted me again. So incidentally, I discovered that I left South Africa about the same time as no, he was the scientific advisor. He was a South African, to the government here.
David King? No.
Yeah, he was also, he left in '62, so
I'm interviewing him shortly.
Right, we met in London, and he said that he left for political reasons, and in fact, I started casting my mind back, because I was in Durban for about 3 months, and I was becoming politically aware. So up to that point, although I was kind of, I was aware there was apartheid, and I was aware that it was questionable, but it wasn't kind of a big issue, right? It wasn't like I was on the barricades, opposing it. It's not, but then when I was in Durban, I got to meet some of the. This is before university, right? I got to meet some of the students, and they were fairly political, and I started talking. And I think I went to some of Athol Fugard's plays. So one I went to, I remember very clearly, was called Blood Knot, and that was closed down almost as soon as I'd seen it in Durban. And I started to get really quite, I don't know, sort of concerned about the whole thing. So maybe it was quite a good thing that I was leaving South Africa, because I think I might have got caught up. So I was talking to David. I felt that we were probably, he was more advanced in his thinking, I think, at that time. We were probably struggling with the same thing, and he left. So did I. So yes, so I took this. We took this boat to Western Australia. Now, my mother at that stage had really calmed down. In other words, I said to you that she was really quite an anxious, nervous person. But she by that time she was really becoming quite a, reasonably calm person. I don't know how real that was, but that's certainly the case. Can I jump back a bit? One of the things that happened in Indonesia, which is one of the reasons why my mother was probably also extremely nervous during that, is my father. They tried to murder him twice. The first time,
Who is they?
Indonesians.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. He was in charge of a group of people on the site, the engineering site, and they took against him for some reason. So what they decided to do was to run him over with a truck and left him for dead, basically. Anyway, he wouldn't die, and came back again. And my father, being my father, so you can imagine this was pretty awful for my mother. Although we just kind of, I was very young. I just saw it as a sort of an accident, really. And my father was clearly going to recover. Anyway, he did, and then no sooner was he out of hospital, then they tried to kill him again. They stuck him full of knives. Same sort of thing, the people on the work site, because there was a lot of tension between the Dutch and the Indonesians, right? Because Indonesia was becoming independent, and the Dutch were the old colonial masters, and they hadn't been very kind to the Indonesians, so there was a lot of tension. So they tried to kill him again, and again left him for dead. And my mother just didn't believe that he was going to die, so she stayed with him in hospital, and he came back. But I expect that really had quite an impact on her, and it would have made her very anxious, actually. But anyway, when we were in South Africa, back in South Africa, we took this boat to Australia. I mean, I remember us being quite calm and at ease with herself. So when we arrived in Australia, things weren't too bad. But as I say, I went to university to study mathematics, as it turned out, and they went to the East Coast, and so that's when I met my wife, Julia. I mean, the story is, we tell this story, and I suppose there's some truth on it, is that we met in the mathematics lecture theatre because we were both short-sighted and couldn't see the backboard, right? So we had to sit in front. And of course, what students like, well, the students in Western Australia were like that anyway. They tried to populate the benches right at the back of the lecture theatre rather than the front. But people like myself and so on, and Julia. So anyway, we got talking and discovered that we rather liked each other, and carried on from there, really. So we went through our first degree together, and then soon got married in '65, which is pretty much the year we graduated. And I didn't like the formal education I was getting at the university. I resented the canned and very limited and very boring way in which they presented stuff to us. So I spent a lot of my time actually getting books out of the library and reading around subjects, and actually literally, well, not exactly ignoring. I mean, I used to take notes during lectures, but then at the end of the year, I would just burn them or throw them away. I would find them quite useless. I seem to have, I had this sort of approach to science that I had to kind of get the story in my head so that I could walk around. At other times I could think about the stuff, and I had to have a story. It wasn't enough to just have a proof. So in mathematics, I mean, to give an example, they would show us, or they'd give us a lecture on the Hahn-Banach theorem, which is an important theorem in mathematics, and they would meticulously go through the proof of it on the blackboard. And this just didn't work for me. I found it totally sort of uninteresting. So I had to go away and kind of read about the Hahn-Banach theorem, how it fitted into other bits of mathematics, and maybe even read about the people involved, right? So for me, always, my interest in science in particular was always sort of added to by knowing about the people who were doing the science. So at that stage, I had already read, before I came to university, I had already read and understood the special theory of relativity. But at the same time, I found out a lot about Einstein. So it was important to me to know the theory and to know about the person who actually produced it. So
Which is why I'm
sorry?
why I'm interviewing you now for the same reason.
So anyway, so that was quite interesting, and so I ended up. So as I said, I wanted to do physics really, and so actually theoretical physics, because I had learnt about special theory and so on, these sort of things, before I came to university, and I wanted to continue on with that. So the physics department in Western Australia had a strong experimental component. They expected students to do a lot of experimentation work, and it was boring work. I didn't like it at all. It was very elementary. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that because you had to stand while you were doing the experiments, and they were you did them in the afternoon, and it would take 3 hours. I, at that stage, suffered very badly from migraines, and whenever I stood for a long period, I would get a migraine, and so then the whole day would be wiped out, and this was going on and on and on. So I went to the professor of physics, and I said, look, I can't do this. I mean, isn't there some way that I can just do theoretical physics without having to go through all this experimental stuff? And he said, no, I'm afraid not. You either do the experimental work, or else you'll have to do something else. And I think it may have been him that suggested, I don't know, but he suggested I focus on applied mathematics, and that's what I ended up doing. So I did a lot of, so I did some physics actually, and as a while, I did a course in general relativity, which is in a sense theoretical physics. So yes, and it was a strange period actually, because I think the university worked their students very hard, but I felt at least that they didn't instill an excitement about the subject during the lectures. They didn't motivate us very well, and I think I wasn't the only one. I think most of the students I spoke to were like that. The thing in mathematics was that the dropout rate was very high. So although I started with a large cohort, by the time I got through to the end, there were a few was left. Of course, the funny thing is that I thought that I wasn't going to make it, because when I was tested in first year at the university by a psychologist, they did these tests, and he said, you're totally unsuited for university work. Right? We suggest that you go and do something else. Do not stay at university. I thought, great. And I think it may have been something to do with the fact that my command of English at that point wasn't all that great anymore, because I'd been speaking mostly German and Afrikaans, although I had to do things still in English. So that may have had an effect. Anyway, I obviously resisted that and went on. But I mean, the thing that I remember most about being at university is finding these wonderful things to read in the library, right? Books on maths or physics, and I would go away and just read them, and that's how I learned a lot of the stuff that I had to learn. I couldn't learn it from the lectures. Lectures didn't work for me. I mean, it was weird really. And my wife to this day, she said, well, you sort of did the right thing, she says, because I used to just work on the lecture notes, and now I have retained nothing of that stuff, whereas you seem to have retained, as I was putting it, these are not her words, the story of it all, right? And the story has stayed with me about a lot of the science that I learnt at university, and it sort of followed on.